Good evening. So tonight we're going to talk about wearable computers, specifically wearable computers in healthcare. So some objectives for this presentation. At the conclusion of the presentation, the learner will be able to define wearable computers, be able to give two examples of wearable computers, be able to describe current diabetes and cardiac management using wearable computers, be able to describe future uses of wearable computers for diabetes and cardiac management, as well as be able to describe the impact of wearable computers on healthcare modeling. So what are wearable computers? Steve Mann is known to some as the father of wearable computing, so he's a very respectable source to go back to figure out an actual definition for wearable computers. Mann's definition is wearable computing is the study of or practice of inventing, designing, building, or using miniature body-borne computational and sensory devices. Wearable computers may be worn under, over, or in clothing, or may also be themselves clothes. So the wearability aspect provides an important concept in that these computers can be used in multiple settings. They can be seen in the home, they can be seen in public, you can use them anywhere. Some additional features of wearable computers that specifically affect healthcare and have implications in healthcare include the ability to sense and analyze the user's environment and the ability to complement, intellect, or enhance senses. So just to give you a better idea of what wearable computers are, here's just a few examples of wearable technology available that we see every day and we don't even recognize them most of the time. Fitbit or the Apple Watch are becoming very normal sightings on wrists of most people. If you go into the grocery store, you'll notice them. Continuous glucose monitoring devices are seen. You will, a lot of times, especially as an ER nurse, you recognize that that person walking by you that has the string going into their pocket, and you know full well that they've got their insulin in their pocket for their pump. Another common example is virtual reality goggles. You'll see them for video games, but they're also becoming used a lot more in training for medical skills, specifically in surgery. We're seeing quite a bit of that starting to come out now. So what is the prevalence of wearable devices? So I gave you two examples here, the Fitbit and the Apple Watch. The Fitbit has 28 million users at the moment, and Apple Watch has almost 31 million. So we're talking almost 60 million people, and this is only these two devices alone. The wearable computers are very prevalent in today's society. So this is a very broad overview of timeline of development of wearable computers. It is by no means a list of all the wearable computers ever developed, but it does give some highlights of some of the big things that have occurred over time. Wearable computers actually date much further back in time than most people realize. In 1644, a ring that would have been considered smart in today's society was developed. It actually contained an abacus for performing calculations. Another very pivotal development occurred in 1955 when Edward Thorpe, a sophomore at UCLA, began contemplating the roulette wheel. He then combined forces with Claude Shannon, a mathematics professor at MIT. So in 1961, the duo actually developed a wearable computer capable of predicting when a roulette ball would fall. The device was quite ingenious as it was worn in the shoe. It was operated by the big toe and sent a musical scale to small earpieces indicating where the ball would end its journey. And it was actually fairly successful. So they actually did models in the basement of the professor as well as took this into real casinos and found that it had a gain of approximately 44%. Interestingly, though, it took until 1985 for Nevada to pass a law prohibiting these types of devices in their casinos. Some other things that came after this device included the digital hearing aid in the late 80s, and then, of course, the development of the Fitbit and the Apple Watch in just recent years. The wearable computer devices are already in use for multiple healthcare applications. These include prevention and recognition of falls, monitoring physical activity, tracking physical activity, reminders to actually get up and move, as well as mental status monitoring. There's actually algorithms that are based on a person's vital signs as to how their mental status is doing. There's quite a bit of potential for sports and rehabilitative medicine. These different devices have the ability to monitor movement, workload, and even heart rate. So these data points can actually be used together to look at improvement in performance. And this is quite obvious to be used by athletes as they want to improve their physical performance, but it can also be used in healthcare. Think about those victims of stroke or victims of brain and spinal cord injuries or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease patients who need to improve their physical conditioning and need to know how they can do that. So to narrow down the vast field of wearable computers in healthcare, we're going to specifically focus on diabetes and cardiac management. So diabetes management right now, there's several options available on the market. One of the biggest things that has come out in recent years is the continuous glucose monitoring. So this is a device that attaches to the skin that provides a real-time blood glucose level. So the person doesn't necessarily have to stop what they're doing. They can look at their phone or their smart device and see what their blood sugar is. Depending on the device, it takes the blood sugar every 5 to 10 minutes, depending on how it's set. The other nice thing here is that it allows for alarms for when the blood sugar gets low or high. So then the person doesn't even need to realize it. And this is really important with your hypoglycemic patients that sometimes don't get any sensation that their blood sugar is dropping until it's too late. And this will actually give them a warning. The other thing that this might prove to be very beneficial for is what's called a dead in bed syndrome. So unfortunately, there are a large number of very young diabetic patients that just don't wake up in the morning, and they don't have really any reason as to why this happens. But the working theory at the moment is that the blood sugar drops too low overnight and the person actually stops breathing because of it. However, if you have one of these devices on, the alarm goes off that it's low, it's going to wake you up before your blood sugar gets too low, or wake up your partner or someone else in the house so that they can fix your blood sugar before it becomes a fatal outcome. Some systems actually have started to combine the glucose monitoring with an insulin pump so that it'll automatically adjust. So if your blood sugar does start to drop in the middle of the night, the insulin infusion stops. Some examples currently on the market include the Guardian Connect system, Eversense continuous glucose monitoring. Dexcom is just about ready to release their 7th version of their continuous glucose monitor, and the MiniMed 670G. So cardiac management also has quite a few benefits to wearable devices. Some of these wearable devices will actually allow for continuous ECG monitoring outside of a hospital. And this is fairly new. We've never been able to do this in the past. Things like the Holter monitor have been around for a while, or the Zio patch, but the disadvantage here is that both of them cannot be analyzed in real time. So the patient goes into their doctor, they get fitted for the device, they go home, they have to come back, then the doctor can tell them what their heart was doing during that time. However, some of the newer technologies, such as the Nuvant mobile cardiac telemetry, is actually in real time. So someone is actually watching that cardiac monitor at a remote location. Should something come up that is concerning, the patient can be told, you need to go to the hospital, you need to do something about this. I've actually seen this happen where I had a patient come into the ER. We asked him, why are you here? He said, I feel fine. The company monitoring my cardiac monitor said I need to come in. And he had actually had about a 2-minute episode of VTAC that he had no idea. And this picture up here in the right-hand corner is actually the Zoll Life Vest. So this is a wearable cardioverter defibrillator. So this is for patients that are at a high risk for going into either VFib or VTAC and are going to need cardioversion. This can be used for a patient that's waiting to go in for surgery. They can't because their blood glucose, their blood levels are too thin. They're not ready to go into surgery quite yet. They can wear this device. Some people will actually even go home with them, and they have to wear it 24 hours a day just in case they do go into a strange rhythm. It immediately shocks them back into a normal rhythm. So this is really awesome. The Apple Watch just came out with their newest version. One of the things that they encountered with the last version is that AliveCore came out with an app that could be added to the Apple Watch that could actually do ECG monitoring. So Apple, of course, had to build that into their watch as quickly as possible to put AliveCore out of business. So what they did is they came up with an ECG monitor that's built into the Apple Watch. And the wearer can actually set it to give them alarms if their heart rate gets too high or their heart rate gets too low. Or one of the really neat things that's come out is it'll tell you if your heart rate is irregular. So what we're looking at here is the potential that that person could be in atrial fibrillation. Some of these studies that they did are actually showing that it's fairly accurate, up into the high 90s percent of being accurate of identifying atrial fibrillation. Of course, Apple is saying they can't identify atrial fibrillation, you need to go to your doctor, but at least this person is getting a warning that there's a problem, you need to go to your doctor. Because the problem with atrial fibrillation is some people don't feel it at all, and it's completely asymptomatic. And then the long-term issue here is that atrial fibrillations put people at a higher risk for having blood clots, having strokes, having heart attacks. All these things can happen. Now, if we can identify very early on that a person is in atrial fibrillation, we can prevent all of those things from happening. This is really, really exciting technology coming out. So what does the future look like in these wearable devices? There is a lot of research going on these devices right now. In diabetes, one of the biggest things out there in development is the artificial pancreas. So the artificial pancreas would actually take over the actions of a real pancreas. And what they do is they monitor the blood sugar, they release or retract insulin dosage based on that, so the person doesn't ever have to deal with managing their blood sugar. There are some newer ones coming out to the market. Dexcom just got their approval in January of 2020 to release theirs to the general public. So we'll be seeing how well these work here in the very near future. I actually do have some personal experience here with this. I have a friend whose daughter was able to be part of one of the studies of these artificial pancreases, and they said it was an absolutely phenomenal experience. Her blood sugar and her hemoglobin A1C were in better range than ever before, and they were actually quite disappointed when they had to give it back because it wasn't an FDA approved device quite as of yet. But hopefully the device will be coming out to the market shortly. Smart socks. So smart socks there are some newer versions of this available on the market. What they do is they look for the temperature and inflammation in the feet. Because the problem with a diabetic is that their feet tend to be numb from the damage to the nerves. So they're not noticing if they stub their toe, if they step on something, if their foot starts to get infected, they don't notice it. And the problem is that a lot of diabetics end up with toe and foot and ankle amputations, which is never a good thing. So if we can actually use a sock that tells them there's a problem, you need to check your feet, or it emails their doctor and says there's a problem, you need to check your patient's feet, maybe we can prevent some of these amputations from occurring. So these next two items actually are not to the market yet. They're just conceptualized ideas at this point. The smart contact lenses, the thought here is that you can actually check blood sugar through the eyes. So if you put contact lenses on, those contact lenses should be able to detect what your blood sugar is. Kind of a novel idea, because then you don't have to be wearing the sensor that the artificial pancreas or the continuous glucose monitors need. Unfortunately, it is not quite out there yet, so there's no studies to see how well this is going to work, but we can definitely be on the future looking for what's coming. The other idea that's been proposed and conceptualized is smart pills. So what the smart pills do is it actually gives the person as well as their doctor information about what medications they're taking, and it gives them an actually objective measure of whether a person is being compliant with their medications. This is something we've never been able to do in the past outside of a hospital where there's staff actually making sure, or a nursing home making sure that they actually took that medication. The cardiology, there's a lot of research going on here as well. So of course, the Apple Watch came out with ECG monitoring. So now, of course, Fitbit is working on this as well. They actually released information just in May of 2020 that they are actively studying to see if they can use a Fitbit to determine if a person is in atrial fibrillation. Really neat idea. Great benefits for people. The other thing that is being done is that we're increasing the number of monitoring leads that are available outside the hospital. So AliveCore has come out with the ability to actually do a 6-lead ECG in your home with your smartphone. Pretty neat idea. Not available as a wearable device yet. Will that be coming? Probably. And the best advantage here is that you can detect those myocardial infarctions or a heart attack really, really early before the person starts having chest pain. Once they start having just minor changes in their EKG, if we notice it before it gets to the point where there's damage to the heart, we can save more muscle and definitely improve the quality of life of these patients. So I know I talked a lot about diabetes and cardiology. However, there is a lot of future being investigated for wearable devices for a lot of other syndromes as well. Parkinson's disease, there's actually some studies going on now looking at monitoring dyskinesia. So in the past, what a patient's had to do is go into their neurologist, into their doctor's office, and the doctor can look at how much dyskinesia is going on, or they have to take the word of the patient and their family. And it's very subjective and difficult to quantify whether they're improving or whether they're getting worse. So there's also some studies with autistic people that allows them to identify and detect their emotions. So it's looking at their vital signs, if their heart rate is going up, what gives them alarm, what's going on, so they can stop and think, what's going on? Why am I getting anxious? What can I do to stop that? Depression, there's actually some studies going on. There was a study recently done on bipolar patients looking at their heart rate variability. So does that heart rate variability lead back to whether they're going into a depressive mode or whether they're actually going into a manic mode? And if we can identify this before things get out of hand, it's much easier to control. The other thing, especially with bipolar patients, is that they like being in that manic phase. So they're not likely to go to their doctor and say, I'm going into a manic phase until they're already in deep trouble. And this way, if we could catch it sooner, decrease the amount of time these patients have to spend in hospitals, keeps them at home, keeps their families more normal, and definitely improves their quality of life. The last one I put on here is multiple sclerosis. So multiple sclerosis is a very complex condition, very near and dear to my heart, and is very expensive in terms of both the financial burden of treatments as well as the quality of life of these patients. Wearable devices are being studied to look at multiple aspects of the condition. So some of the things that these wearable devices can do is to detect falls, and look at the fatigue levels. How much exercise are these patients actually getting? Are they really sleeping as well or as poorly as they say? And it can look at the walking ability of these patients, because the walking ability is what really puts these patients into long-term care facilities or makes it more difficult for them to live on their own. So the advantage here is, again, we have an objective data. Instead of the patient have to go to the doctor and saying, I feel like I'm having more trouble walking, there is definitely quantifiable objective data to quantify exactly how bad this patient is. Did this medicine work? Did this medicine not work? What do we need to fix this? There's great potential to keep people at home, keep them more functional, and definitely make their quality of life better. So what is the potential on modeling with these wearable healthcare computers? So one of the things, if you're looking at our diagram here, is that we've always relied on the past is our patient input as to how they're doing at home. How are they managing their blood sugar? How are their symptoms being managed? Is their medication working? And unfortunately, sometimes what the patient gives us may not be as accurate as we would like, or maybe we're not asking those questions as well as we need to. For example, the patient that we ask how they're managing their blood sugar, and they tell us that they're managing it quite well at home, only to get a hemoglobin A1C that's off the charts and indicating that their blood sugar was not managed at home accurately. But now we have these wearable computers that give us very concrete, very specific, and very accurate data. And in fact, there's an infinite amount of data that we'd be able to collect from these computers. Now that we have this data, we can use it to better model and understand patient physiology. So this data can then be used to create more accurate models than we've ever seen in the past, even models very specific to individual patients. Imagine the possibility for treating patients if an endocrinologist could create an accurate model of blood sugar levels for a specific patient, and then use that model in conjunction with an artificial pancreas. A similar potential is available for cardiac monitoring. Asymptomatic atrial fibrillation often goes undetected. If these episodes can be identified, more accurate models can be developed to help identify patients at risk and when these potential episodes may occur. Maybe there's something going on physiologically that we have never recognized in the past. The potential to learn from this data and these models is just immense. But the other thing we can use with these models is to better educate ourselves as healthcare providers. We can use these models to create simulations that give healthcare providers an actual, very realistic expectation of how patients are going to react to different medications and react to different treatments. Never in the past have we been able to do that because we're basing everything on what our patient is saying, which may not be as accurate as we like. So what is the end result here? The big thing to take home here is that wearable computers in healthcare have a phenomenal potential. they have the potential to give us a better understanding of what's going on inside our patients, what's going on with their health when they're outside of our hospital, outside of our doctor's office, so that we can get a better picture of what's going on and ultimately improve the care that we're providing. And of course, improved care just leads to better outcomes of these patients. It also means an improved quality of life for many patients, being able to stay home. Imagine that patient that doesn't lose their foot because of an infection, because their endocrinologist told them they're diabetic and should purchase these smart socks, and that smart sock alarm saying you have an infection going on in your foot. And so instead of ending up with a massive infection and an amputation, they took some antibiotics for a couple of weeks and now made a full recovery. The other thing that some of the research is showing is that the younger population is very interested in using their wearable devices to monitor their own health at home. So this is definitely something we're going to be seeing in the future, is these devices being sold to the general public. And how is that going to impact healthcare in the long term? We're going to have to wait and see. But there is definitely going to be an increase in the amount of technology in healthcare and wearable devices overall.